Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with an overview of Khepri. Now, in retrospect, I probably should have done this before doing the support Khepri series for each of the choosable maps, but I wound up trying to do it in the first episode. It felt really rushed. I didn't get to cover everything I wanted to. I didn't get to calmly explain to you the pros and cons of Khepri, why he is where he is on the tier lists, all that other stuff. So from now on, after doing this one, this type of video will precede this individual series for each god. So for the next god, I'll be doing a video like this, doing an overview of the god first, and then get into gameplay examples with that god. But better late than never, so here we go. I want to actually first start talking about Khepri's passive. Now, for a lot of gods, the passive is a pretty big deal. For some it isn't. For some it's very important that you build around it. For Khepri, it's 50-50. See, all Khepri really has to do is just make sure he builds as much health as possible. Most of your items should incorporate in some way health, if not all of your items. There are a couple of exceptions, and I'll discuss those a little later, but by and large, a lot of your items that you purchase should involve health, because that will make your passive shield so much better. Now, initially you're going to think, well, that's not going to give me that much, but as I'm going to show you later, let's take a popular example. 400 HP increase is pretty common on a whole lot of various things, right? So that is a really nifty 8 health per item of that kind, and that's just being, fairly mediocre with 400 life. I'll give you some specific examples later, and that's going to wind up giving you 8 per, or specifically 2 for every 100, so that's going to be 8 extra health total, and while it doesn't sound like much, when you do that by 400 times 6, that's 2,400, and then suddenly you're getting 48 extra health. That's an entire attack. That is extra damage from chin size that you're surviving. That's maybe some extra damage from a critical. It can make a difference, and it makes more of a difference than you really realize. If you've been paying attention to the bonus, what I call bonus health, basically, from this passive, it can really rack up to a huge amount. Now, the other 50% of this conversation is if you're playing alongside Khepri and you have the choice between an item that performs one function and doesn't give you any health, or an item that performs a similar function but does, maybe consider at least a little stronger the item that provides you with health, because this will directly boost your bonus health that you get from Khepri. Now, you're not always going to have this, obviously, but in the late game, this, again, can really help you out. Common examples would be mostly warrior items. The warriors are really going to take the best advantage of this, although mages can get in on this too, to some extent. Junglers as well, but Void Shield over, say, Berserker's Shield potentially, or over some other kind of physical protection item you would normally build. Say, maybe you want to build Frostbound Hammer over Hastened Katana. With the exception of Mercury, it won't really make a difference. Things of that nature, you really want to think a bit more about what specifically you're building. Now, Khepri's most actually strategic ability is Abduct, and I'm going to get into why with the items, because you can interplay item passives and Abduct really intelligently if you know what you're doing. Now, Abduct itself is kind of the reason why, whether or not Khepri is mid or low tier is kind of in contention. Some people will say Khepri is too high risk because of this ability, and as a result is low tier, and there are some people who say, well, if you know what you're doing, he's mid tier. I fall along the lines that Khepri is mid tier if you know what you're doing and if you build right. Khepri's early game tends to be pretty weak overall. A lot of his abilities, you'll notice, play off of percentages. For example, 2% of your maximum health, including your natural level up health, which means everyone around you will be getting a higher and higher amount of bonus HP as the match goes on. Rising Dawn gives a protection debuff of 25% and a damage mitigation buff of 30%, which is more and more impactful as the game goes on. So you can see an even more Scarab's Blessing, revived health, 25 to 45%. Khepri basically does not have a great early game. Khepri's early game is terrible, frankly. His wave clear is good. Actually, his wave clear is surprisingly good for a Guardian. But at the end of the day, Khepri really shines in the late game. The problem right now with Khepri is that there's so many excellent anti-tank late game items that Khepri's having a really hard time. You can still play him very well, but right now I would argue that yes, he is fairly mid-tier at this point, maybe lower mid-tier at this juncture in Conquest, but the smaller the arena, the smaller the actual map, the better he does overall, because he can provide more bonus health to more allies, and he can hit more allies with Rising Dawn. But Abduct is the most strategic of his abilities, even if on the surface it doesn't. You're just, dashing forward, grabbing the first god you hit, and pulling them backwards. They're silenced, so they can only auto-attack you. Now, the big problem with Abduct is that because they can still auto-attack you, going for anybody going with an auto-attack build is basically going to have free reign to shred you, unless you build rather specifically, and whether or not you build that specifically depends on how selfish you feel like playing Khepri. I don't normally play Khepri selfishly, and I'll explain what I'm talking about with selfish and non-selfish builds in a hot second. Rising Dawn basically has just two choices. Do you want to reduce the enemy's protections and do a little bit of damage, or do you want to reduce allies' damage? So you basically have that choice. Ideally, you can hit some allies and some enemies at the same time, but there will be moments where you have to make a choice. Now, in a lot of situations, the more likely effective choice is going to be reducing the enemy's protections, because a standard team comp is 3 physical, 2 magical damage, including Khepri, whose magic damage, obviously, he's a Guardian. Now, Rising Dawn only reduces physical protections, so this slightly physical-heavy comp isn't really going to hurt your team's chances of winning, like it normally would slightly tend towards not doing as well against, say, a 3 magic comp, 2 physical. So this can really help with that, especially if you're in a party. Khepri works particularly well if you have audio chat with party members, because you can say, hey, I'm going to abduct this fool, then I'm going to Rising Dawn him, slap this guy down, or even better, you Rising Dawn first, then you abduct, because then the enemy just gets wailed on with decreased physical protections. As a fantastic example, Solar Flare is very simple, it's not terribly strategic, you just throw that down, they're rooted. Same kind of thing with Scarab's Blessing, although this does create an interesting problem with Khepri. See, the issue here, essentially speaking, is when you throw Scarab's Blessing on an ally, generally speaking, one of 3 things will happen, broadly speaking. One is that they die and they get revived to your location. This is a whole separate conversation. 2, they start running away, decide that because they have the blessing, they should go in, and then they go in just as the blessing is about to end. The third is that they'll go absolute ham, hoping to die first. Now, we're going to deal with the third one first. Whether or not they die while going ham is something that is their problem, basically, at that point. You really just have to throw it out there on someone who's close to death and just leave it in their hands. That's fine. That's totally fine. It's no longer your problem. The second option, obviously, where they retreat and then they come back in just when it's too late and they die, again, not your problem. You've thrown out the blessing. They should have just left. Some people do. I've noticed that slowly increasing as a response. A 4th response has slowly been appearing of people straight running away when they have this, which is fine because it increases movement speed for that specific reason. The revive is not the main point of Scarab's Blessing. The main point of Scarab's Blessing is to get somebody out of their life. If they die in the process and they get revived to your location, that creates a problem. This is scenario 1, where they get revived. Now, the problem with somebody getting revived if you're in the middle of a really hot fight is that they're very likely to die right afterwards if you're on the front line, which is what you're supposed to be doing. You are supposed to be on the front line. That is your job as a support. You're supposed to be there, getting the picks, setting up the fights. If someone is in the middle of dying, then you now have this weird problem, where if you stay on the front line and they die, they're going to be revived with you on the front line. Now, if this is a warrior, that's fine. If this is an unusually tanky mage or jungler, that's fine. They'll probably be able to make it out alive. But if you're resurrecting a mage or a hunter that isn't tanky, you're going to be basically guaranteeing they die again, which is problematic. So you then have this weird urge, and depending on where you're positioned at the start of the fight, how well this will decide how well this happens, you will have this weird urge to get out of the fight. Now, this is the real problem with Khepri, or at least his ultimate, is that if you decide that the smart move is to get out of the fight, that means that, assuming your warrior is alive, to frontline, you're left with one frontline until this character dies, and then they get revived, and then you're trying basically to ensure they get out, because if they don't get out, then there's no point using your ult on them in the first place, and that's a decently long cooldown. This is the main problem with Khepri. The rest of his kit I love to pieces, but I do have some problems with this ult. Now, there are situations where I absolutely adore using this ult. Generally speaking, if I am late to a fight, someone's probably been picked out of the jungle or something, and they're near death. I Scarab's Blessing, they get killed, they res to me, and then I go in to support the rest of the team while they go back and heal. This is the ideal scenario for the Scarab's Blessing. But if you're already in a fight and you see somebody dying, this is potentially a hindrance. Now, basically, your best option here is throwing the Scarab's Blessing and hoping they do the smart thing and run away. If you have the Scarab's Blessing on you and you are not a stinking warrior, run, please. For the sake of any Khepri you play with. If you're not playing a tanky warrior or a tanky assassin, I'll give you the tanky assassin, and a very select number of mages, like Anubis, could probably pull this off as well. But unless you have these circumstances where you have enough protections and enough self-heal where you can bring your own health back up, or you can otherwise continue fighting on the front line where you're supposed to be, run. Please, if you're a hunter, I don't care who you are as a hunter, run. You will not make it out alive unless you've got some kind of miracle tucked in your back pocket that I and every other Khepri on the planet doesn't know about. But please run. For our sanity. We want to stay in that fight. We want to keep supporting our allies. And if you die, Khepri flashes briefly. It's very noticeable. It's a pretty vivid flash. Bright yellow. Very glowy. In that moment, that Khepri has to make a split-second decision. Do I stay on the front lines and almost guarantee this lunatic dies again? Or do I try to get out of this fight so they can get out alive? And depending on who it is, or where the Khepri is positioned, is going to decide whether or not this is possible and what decision this Khepri is going to make. But either way, this Khepri is now thrown into a very tough, difficult decision right in the middle of potentially a huge team fight. It's not a good situation, and I do wish this could possibly be altered a little bit. I would personally prefer this to be slightly buffed, where they're revived at 40% health, or even 35% health, but then they get a gradual heal up to 50%. Would probably make this a little bit better, in my opinion. That's the only opinion on a potential change in Khepri's kit I'm going to offer here. Other than potentially an attack speed slow on Abduct, which would also really help Khepri out. But that is the problem with Scarab's Blessing. So if you have the blessing on you and your Khepri starts going ballistic, this is why. Your Khepri is trying to figure out what is the best choice in this situation, and it's not an easy choice in any circumstance. There are a couple of occasions where circumstances will cause the Khepri to lean towards one or the other decision, but it's a panic, and the Khepri may not make the right one. So, please run. Again, unless you're a really tanky assassin or warrior and you're supposed to be on the front line anyways, head for the hills. Now, to talk specifically about Abduct, because Abduct is the most fascinating ability here. You can do a lot of very interesting things with Abduct, and you can really use Abduct to your advantage. There are a couple of items that I want to talk to you about. First off is Mystical Mail. Now, I don't usually play Khepri this aggressively, but there are moments where I kind of feel forced to. When you abduct somebody, you are basically absolutely guaranteed to inflict 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds worth of damage using Mystical Mail, because once your Abduct ends, it's not like they're often... Some players do, just use their escape ability immediately out of panic, but a lot of them don't. They keep fighting, especially if they're an auto-attacker. So you can just wail on them with free damage. The only problem is that Mystical Mail deals magic damage, and Khepri does not enhance this, really. So that is a bit of a problem here. But otherwise, Mystical Mail is pretty fun to use in this particular context. Actually, most of this tree is really effective with Khepri overall. Sovereignty is, again, specifically the aura. We're not going to talk about that. But Midgardian Mail can help you survive your Abduct. The problem I really have with this is that they can also just not attack you at all. Some gods don't. Basically only the ones that use auto-attacking as their main source of damage will auto-attack you, so this is somewhat questionable in use. If the enemy team has a large number of auto-attackers, I'll consider this. It's also really fun with Emperor's Armor, because Emperor's Armor does increase your structure's attack speed. So if you abduct someone under a tower or a phoenix, they're probably dead, especially in the early game. It's just not going to end well for them in a lot of situations, and they recently buffed Emperor's Armor to have a really respectable 60 physical protections. But pretty much this whole tree, you should give some genuinely serious thought to. Beyond that, there's nothing really here that matters much. You could use Hide of the Enemy and Lion, but this doesn't provide you with the kind of health that you really want to be seeing. There are circumstances... I believe there's been 2 matches since the start of the season where Hide of the Enemy and Lion was the correct choice for me because I needed that MP5 and I still needed physical protections. Now granted, this was in a situation with an extremely heavy amount of physical enemies. I think there was 4 or 5, so it made more sense in this context, but usually in those situations you're going to want Midgardian Mail anyways. Hide of the Enemy and Lion does provide you with 35 more, but that health is pretty delicious, and the passive triggers more often than you're going to be using the block stacks of Hide. Especially in the early game. If you're early game, Midgardian Mail is just a lot better. Hide of the Enemy Line only really comes online in the late game, and that's not really when Khepri needs the help. Another fun thing to do, now that Mail of Renewal has been changed, is actually to use Mail of Renewal. See, every time you're hit, you get stacks, which increases your protections, and then 5 hits later, you heal yourself and everyone around you. So essentially speaking, abducting a ADC is not quite as risky a prospect, especially if you combine it with Midgardian Mail or the Witchblade. And Mail of Renewal can actually help keep you alive, and you can bait out enemies into hitting you if you abduct them. It's absolutely phenomenal, where the enemy is actually helping you because they're attacking you. A similar thing can be pulled off with Stone of Gaia against the correct team comps. If the enemy team comp has a variety of ways they can push you around and otherwise move you, Stone of Gaia can also be used with Abduct to sort of bait the enemy out into doing that, because if they push you, they pull you, or they grab you while you're abducting someone, it interrupts the Abduct, and that's pretty common knowledge for a lot of people who've played against Khepri at this point. So when you abduct someone and your Stone of Gaia passive, your first passive, is ready to go, you can force the activation of this by simply abducting basically anyone who doesn't have a move ability, a push ability, or what have you. And some ally of theirs will go out of their way to break the Abduct, thereby triggering Stone of Gaia. It's phenomenal. It's absolutely fantastic. If you're in a really magic-heavy comp, Void Stone is pretty much a must-buy, in all honesty. Because while they're in your claws, they have reduced magic protections, and to some extent this extends to Stone of Binding, but I generally find that Khepri's early game is so horrific that I want to try and get some much more respectable protection items online first. But Void Stone can occasionally be very useful on Khepri. Beyond this, while I do occasionally use Spear the Magus or Divine Ruin on Khepri, it's not very often, and I don't really care much about that otherwise. Witchblade I mentioned earlier. Similar case to Midgardian Mail. Whether you could prefer this over Midgardian Mail or not is a personal preference. I usually will go for Witchblade instead of Midgardian Mail, personally, now that they've adjusted it. There will be occasional incidents where I will build both. I'm a bold man, but that also works. Another interesting thing that not a whole lot of people consider, I've only seen 2 other Khepris do this, is Pridwin with Abduct. Now, normally I don't build Pridwin because it doesn't have any health, and the protections, even though they're two different kinds of protections are a little bit low. The cooldown reduction is amazing, though. But what you can theoretically do is throw your ult out on your ally, wait exactly one, well, not exactly 1 second, but wait a second, maybe two, abduct someone. Boom. Again, the problem here primarily is that this is magic damage, so... And another issue I have with this, which is generally why you will not often see me pull this strategy, is that this damage has to be 50... This damage is 50% of the remaining health, which, when you abduct someone, you're a sitting duck yourself. So it's not unusual to get the Pridwin shield and then have it just get destroyed before it can burst. Now, if you're only doing this for the shield that Pridwin provides, then I would actually suggest the substantially more effective Hide of the Urchin shield, which is just a better shield overall. It's more reliable. The Hide of the Urchin gives you more protections in the long run. It gives you health. If you're looking for a health shield on Khepri because you want to survive your abducts, Hide of the Urchin is it. Magi's Cloak actually is also a very respectable item here because it can prevent your abduct from being interrupted once every minute, basically. Every little over a minute. But these two items are really good. I almost never build Mantle of Discord or Spirit Robe, in all honesty. I haven't built either of these in a very long time because the other two are just so much better for Khepri. Beyond that, there's really not a whole lot to say, although I will give the argument that potentially Oni Hunter's Garb is fairly nice, because you're basically forcing one enemy near you, so that's a guaranteed 3% damage mitigation. Whether or not you actually choose to take advantage of that is up to you. I don't usually build this. I'm usually going for Genji's Guard, because again, when you abduct someone, everyone and their brother, mother, and sister is going to be trying to stop you from abducting that player. That includes usually that's going to be enemy guardians. That's the usual culprit. Sometimes the enemy warriors, but often the enemy mages will also take a stab. And at that point, boom, your cooldowns are just reduced by 3 seconds. Thank you. Genji's Guard also provides you with health and cooldown reduction. Oni Hunter's Guard provides you with a little less health, a little less protections, a little less MP5, crowd control reduction, which is pretty easy to get nowadays anyways. Just not as important. I almost never build Shogun's Kusari on Khepri. He doesn't use attack speed, and there are just better ways you can support your team anyways. But Abduct is really where you can hopefully understand the various cool ways in which you can really utilize Abduct. And it's absolutely fantastic. And actually a shout out here to Tainted Steel and its evolutions, where you can kind of pull the same stunt as well, because enemies, say you're up against a Chung on the enemy team, and you abduct some ally of hers. Now, one of her instincts is going to be to hit you with her heal, which will heal her ally. You build that Tainted Amulet, not so much, eh? It can be very effective. Now, this one's fairly iffy because there has to be enough enemy healing first, and second off, the enemy players have to be of the mindset that healing the ally is more important, or equally as important, as stopping the abduct, which is a bit of a tough sell. So I don't usually see this being useful in that way, but it's potentially possible. But that's really what I wanted to specifically talk about in terms of Abduct. It's just it can be an incredibly strategic ability, and this is why I will always argue to the end of my days, at least for now, that Khepri is a mid-tier Guardian. Yes, he is fairly risky. Yes, his early game is horrifically weak. It's terrible, but a late game Khepri, if he's allowed to flourish and he is properly followed up with, is almost unstoppable. And there's a lot of really cool things you can do with Abduct. If you haven't played Khepri before, I encourage you, please try him. He is amazing. I personally prefer to play him in Conquest, because I really do think he's best there. You can pull off some great jungle surprise ults. Now, I do want to talk briefly about Khepri as a potential god in other roles. Obviously, as a guardian, his primary role is support. He is, though, however, what I would call a specialized guardian. In other words, he plays extremely well in the support role and terribly in any other role. I mentioned throughout my series that Khepri could currently, because of itemization, potentially do a decent job in solo lane, and I'll stand by that statement. He could theoretically do okay in solo lane. The problem is that doing okay is often not enough. Doing okay will often get you just killed, dragging your team down, etc. The main problem with Khepri being used in the solo lane, or even the jungle role, which I have seen and personally tested, is the ult. The ult is really tough to use in those situations. It really is designed for supporting other people, and while jungling has its potential, you could theoretically ult a nearly dead ally before you go for a gank, or you could just go for a res gank. Instead of actually ganking the enemy legitimately, you wander over nearby that lane in the jungle, res your ally, and bail. And just leave it at that. You don't even kill the enemy. You're just there to revive your ally when they croak. There is potential in that with a jungle Khepri, but at the end of the day, Khepri still isn't hitting hard enough as a jungler to do anything particularly significant. Now, that's not to say I haven't seen Khepri's play jungle effectively. I've seen it. I've played it. That's not the point. The point is it's a huge risk, even if you really know what you're doing. For example, I'm actually going to set up a hypothetical. I'm really comfortable with Khepri. I'm really good with Khepri, not trying to brag or anything. Khepri has problems. I make mistakes. Obviously, you've seen that throughout the series. But I'm a good Khepri player. I'm very comfortable with him. I have a lot of experience with him. I've played with him in jungle. You haven't seen these matches because I hate playing him in jungle. Or a solo lane. But I have done it. You go out and you have a really great Khepri game, and it's primarily because of one of two reasons. One, the enemy team was so not aware of the possibility of a jungling Khepri that their entire view of your team is thrown for a loop and their builds go wild, or they play drastically differently. You see, the interesting thing about playing gods out of role is that people generally identify the god with their role, or the class with the role that they're supposed to play. So playing a jungling Khepri, when I pop out of the jungle, at any point in a match, the potential exists for the enemy to see me as a guardian and not be threatened, or not feel threatened enough. And then I have animosity on, I've got my hastened ring, and I am slapping them in the next week before they even know what hit them. This is potentially exploitable in any given out-of-role scenario. The problem is that because Khepri's ult or passive do not enhance his damage in any way, shape, or form, it's very tough to weaponize Khepri in a situation where a lot of other guardians could more successfully play similar roles. So if you are going to play Khepri, please don't, unless it's for the memes, don't put him in the solo lane, don't put him in the jungle lane. Please don't make him an ADC, and for the love of all things good and evil, keep him out of the mid lane. But that's all I really wanted to talk about with Khepri. Thank you all very much for listening. Thank you all very much for watching if you did that. If you like this, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, what have you, please leave them down in the comments below. And as always, thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate it. Have a great 24 hours.